On the evening of January 31st, 1953, the coastal villages of the southwestern Netherlands were settling into a quiet winter sleep. Families blew out their candles and pulled up their blankets, listening to the familiar roar of the North Sea wind rattling their windows. They had lived beside these waters for generations, protected by a network of ancient dikes made of earth and stone, confident that the walls would hold as they always did. But out in the dark, an invisible monster was gathering strength, and within 12 hours, the quiet coastline would be completely erased by the sea. To understand why this night turned into one of the greatest disasters in modern European history, one must look at the unique, almost impossible geography of the Netherlands. This is a country whose very name means the lowlands, a vast river delta, where several of Europe's major rivers flow into the cold North Sea. For over 1,000 years, the people here had been engaged in an endless battle against the water. They built artificial mounds called terps to raise their homes above the high tides, and later they began building rings of dikes to pump out the water, creating dry, fertile plains known as polders. But this triumph of human engineering came with a hidden trap. As the water was drained, the organic peat soil dried out, shrunk, and sank. The more water they pumped, the lower the land fell, locking the nation into a perpetual cycle of sinking and pumping. By 1953, a third of the country lay below sea level, with some cities sitting as deep as 7 meters below the waves. The people were living in a giant invisible bowl, separated from the immense weight of the ocean by nothing more than thin walls of earth. As the afternoon of January 31st faded into twilight, the first warning signs of a catastrophic event began to appear on weather charts, though almost no one on land realized it. A massive low-pressure system had swept down from the Atlantic, bringing hurricane-force winds that were now howling across the North Sea. Under normal circumstances, a storm alone was dangerous, but on this particular night, the wind was pushing the ocean directly toward the shallow, funnel-shaped coast of the Netherlands. Worse still, this atmospheric violence was about to collide with a spring tide, an exceptionally high tide caused by the alignment of the moon and sun. Two colossal forces, the celestial tide and the meteorological storm, were marching toward the same coast at the exact same moment. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the barometers in coastal stations were plummeting to historic lows. The wind had shifted to the northwest, screaming at speeds of over 120 kilometers per hour, pile-driving billions of tons of water toward the Dutch coast. In the dark, dike watchmen began their rounds, struggling to stand against the freezing wind as they checked the earthen ramparts with lanterns. They saw the water level rising far faster than anyone had predicted, climbing meters above the normal high tide mark. Yet, there was no mass evacuation. The telephone lines of the era were fragile, and the radio stations of 1953 did not broadcast through the night. They signed off at midnight, leaving the population in complete ignorance of the wall of water looming just off their shores. By midnight, the situation had turned desperate. The water had reached the very tops of the dikes, and the relentless pounding of the waves was beginning to wash away the grass and clay backing of the barriers. When a dike is made of earth, once water starts to spill over the top, the erosion is catastrophic. The soil dissolves, and the entire wall crumbles in minutes. In the pitch-black early hours of February 1st, the sea finally broke through, tearing open the defenses in dozens of places simultaneously. A freezing saltwater torrent roared across the sleepy polders, swallowing villages whole as the residents slept in their beds. People woke up to the terrifying sound of rushing water filling their ground-floor bedrooms. In the darkness, families scrambled in panic, grabbing what they could and climbing into attics, and then onto the cold, wet roofs. The old brick houses, never built to withstand the physical impact of sea waves, began to collapse under the pressure, washing away entire families into the dark, swirling currents. The power grid failed instantly, plunging the flooded provinces into total blackness. The telephone lines were severed, leaving local communities completely isolated, fighting for survival in the middle of a newly formed inland sea that stretched as far as the eye could see. Throughout the morning of February 1st, the scale of the disaster was hidden from the rest of the world. But within the flooded zone, thousands of people were clinging to chimneys and roof tiles, shivering in the freezing winter air, surrounded by floating debris and drowned livestock. Rescue efforts began in a chaotic, desperate fashion. Local fishermen launched their wooden boats into the stormy waters, navigating past submerged telephone poles and floating roofs to pull survivors from the debris. Amateur radio operators became the only link to the outside world, sitting at homemade transmitters for days without sleep to relay desperate coordinates and pleas for help. Slowly, help began to arrive from across the globe. Military amphibious vehicles, fishing boats from neighboring regions, and a few primitive helicopters that hovered over the ruins to lift children and the elderly from the freezing rooftops. Amidst the horror of that night, an extraordinary event occurred at the Grönendijk Dike, along the Hollandsche IJssel River, a story of quick thinking that saved millions of lives. The dike at Grönendijk was the only barrier protecting the most densely populated heart of the Netherlands, including the cities of Rotterdam, The Hague, and Amsterdam. If this dike collapsed, a massive wave would plunge into a bowl containing over 3 million residents, causing a disaster of unimaginable proportions. By early morning, a section of the Grönendijk Dike had begun to collapse, and a terrifying breach was rapidly widening as the water rushed through. The local mayor, desperate to stop the flow but having no sandbags or heavy machinery, made an audacious decision. He approached a local skipper named Ari Evergroen, who was moored nearby with his old coal barge, the Onderneming. The mayor asked the captain to do something that sounded like madness, steer his barge directly into the raging torrent and plug the hole with the hull of his ship. Captain Evergroen did not hesitate. He started his engine and steered his vessel into the turbulent waters of the breach. The current was incredibly powerful, threatening to capsize the boat or wash it through the dike, but with masterclass precision, the captain lined up the barge and let the rushing water slam the hull sideways into the opening. The vessel wedged tightly into the gap, instantly slowing the roaring torrent to a trickle. This heroic act bought the villagers just enough time to rush to the site and dump thousands of sandbags against the ship's hull, securing the dike and preventing a catastrophic inundation of the nation's heartland. By the time the water finally receded, weeks later, the physical and emotional scars of the Great Flood of 1953 were burned into the national consciousness. More than 1,800 people had lost their lives, tens of thousands of homes were destroyed, and vast areas of fertile farmland were ruined by salt water. The illusion of safety was shattered forever. The nation realized that defending their land with simple mud and stone walls was a gamble they could no longer afford to take. Just weeks after the tragedy, the government formed the Delta Commission, tasking the country's greatest minds with a simple, uncompromising mandate: this must never happen again, no matter the cost. Out of this determination was born the Delta Works, the most ambitious and complex engineering project in the history of Europe. The philosophy of the Delta Works was to shorten the coastline by hundreds of kilometers, sealing off the dangerous estuaries and sea arms on the southwest coast so that the sea would have fewer places to strike. For decades, the country invested billions of dollars to construct massive dams, locks, and barriers that pushed the boundaries of human engineering. The crown jewel of this system was the Oosterschelde Barrier, a 9-kilometer-long structure of massive concrete pillars and movable steel gates. Originally, the government planned to build a solid dam to block the sea entirely, but local fishermen and environmentalists protested, arguing that a closed dam would destroy the unique tidal ecosystem and kill the marine life of the bay. In an unprecedented move, the engineers redesigned the project, building a movable barrier that remains open during normal weather to preserve the tides, but closes tightly within minutes when a storm threatens the coast. An even more futuristic marvel was built to protect the vital port of Rotterdam, the Maaslandkering. Since Rotterdam is the busiest port in Europe, blocking the shipping channel with a permanent wall was impossible. The solution was two colossal, hollow steel gates, each the length of the Eiffel Tower, that sit in dry docks on either side of the canal. When supercomputers monitoring the weather predict a dangerous storm surge, the gates automatically float out into the middle of the channel, lock together, and fill with water, sinking to the bottom to form a solid steel shield against the ocean. The entire process is controlled by artificial intelligence to eliminate human hesitation or error when billions of dollars and millions of lives are on the line. With the completion of the Delta Works, the Netherlands established a new global standard of safety, legally mandating that their dikes must be strong enough to withstand a storm so severe that it occurs only once every 10,000 years, a level of protection unmatched by any other nation on Earth. Yet, as the 21st century progresses, the battle is shifting once again. Climate change is melting polar ice sheets, raising sea levels, and producing storm surges far more intense than those of the past. At the same time, the land continues to sink. Dutch engineers have realized that they cannot simply keep building higher and higher concrete walls. A wall that is too high only increases the devastation if it ever fails. This realization has birthed a revolutionary new philosophy. Instead of fighting the water with brute force, they must learn to make space for it. Under a program called Room for the River, the Dutch are doing something that would have shocked their ancestors. They are actively giving land back to the water. They are moving dikes inland, lowering polders to serve as safety valves during high floods, and building entire floating neighborhoods of homes that simply rise and fall with the tides. They have also engineered the sand motor, a massive artificial peninsula of sand that allows natural ocean currents to distribute sand along the coast, reinforcing the beaches naturally without the need for constant dredging. Today, the Dutch have transformed their 1,000-year war with the sea into a highly successful global enterprise. When a coastal city, anywhere in the world, from New York and New Orleans to Jakarta and Venice, faces the threat of rising sea levels, their first phone call is to the water experts of the Netherlands. The lesson of 1953 is not just about the tragedy of a coast swallowed by the sea, but about the incredible resilience of a society that refused to surrender, proving that with unity, meticulous planning, and a willingness to cooperate with nature, even a sinking wetland can be transformed into one of the safest and most prosperous places to live on Earth.